This is not good.
Thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. More about them later in the video.
This is my friend Rory, who I've been friends with since we were in 2nd grade. And this is Rory's 15-foot cedar strip canoe, which he spent the last year building from scratch. Rory's birthday is right around the corner, so today we're gonna be building him a canoe paddle. I don't wanna make just an average wooden canoe paddle, so here's the idea. We're gonna have a Kumiko pattern in the center with contrasting wood perimeter around the outside. I'm a little bit worried about how thin I'm gonna have to make this because paddles are generally pretty thin, but let's get started and see how it goes.
For this paddle, I decided to go with a beaver tail shape because it seems pretty common, and it would give me enough width to highlight the Kumiko pattern that's going to be part of the blade. I'll leave a link below to where you can get a free beaver tail pattern similar to what I used if you're interested in making some paddles yourself. The first thing I had to do was create the router template for the shape of the blade, and this process is just the same as what I had to do on all of my guitar builds, so this went pretty smoothly. I drew a line that was offset inwards by 1/2 inch and cut out the center of the blade. This will help me make an outer border of wood that surrounds the blade. You'll see what I'm talking about in just a second. I decided to go with walnut for this paddle because I thought it would match Rory's boat pretty well. The walnut I'm using is 1 inch thick, which is great for the shaft and handle, but it's much too thick for the blade, so you'll see the problem that this presents in a little bit. I started cutting out the 2 side pieces that I traced using the template, but things went a little unexpectedly.
Whoa. The blade just entirely broke off. That's insane. We are back in business. So I finished cutting out this 1 side piece, and I also cut the second one off camera, which is exactly the same. So now it's time to figure out the shaft and the handle of this paddle. Let's go. So now we have these 2 little pieces of walnut, which you may have guessed are going to be the handle. But I also cut these 2 little maple strips, which I think are gonna make this look a whole lot cooler. You'll see what I'm talking about in just a second. I'm not using regular wood glue, I'm using like watertight, water resistant. Get away from here, B. There we go. Clamp 1 is going on. I'm gonna try something out here. Nice.
After unclamping the paddle, it was starting to look a little bit like a fishing net, but don't worry, I promise we're making a canoe paddle here. It was at this point that I realized I needed to thin out the blade area so it wasn't quite so thick. So I drew some offset lines and decided to try a slightly sketchy cut on the table saw. Luckily the cut went pretty smoothly, so I felt confident to finish the rest of the cuts using the table saw. I was left with this little section on the end which the table saw wasn't able to get, so I used the jigsaw instead. The jigsaw was a little bit aggressive and ended up cracking the wood, but that's nothing I can't fix with some wood glue.
So initially I was thinking I would make the Kumiko grid work also out of walnut, but now that I'm looking at this again, I think it would look even cooler if it was made out of maple. So now I just need to cut a ton of 1/8 inch strips on the table saw. So for this cut, the fence needs to be set really precisely. The final strips need to be just a little bit over 1/8 of an inch so that I have room to sand down any burn marks from the table saw blade. If it's too small, there will be a lot of gaps which will not look good at all. And if the strips are too big, I'll have a lot of sanding to do. I think we're good. Okay, so now it's time to turn these strips into a triangular grid pattern. And I've had some troubles with this in the past where I've had to take a mallet to it, which is not my favorite thing to do. I guess we'll see if things fit together nicely or if I have to take a mallet to it again. Time for sanding. So this is my Kumiko table saw sled, which I built. And this is the secret to getting that perfect triangular grid. Let's get cutting and I'll show you how it works.
So for this first type of strip, I set the blade to 2/3 the height of the strip and started making cuts with the sled, which is set to a 60-degree angle from the blade. I have a more in-depth video about making Kumiko, which is linked below if you want to check it out. Next, I move the strip to the front of the sled to cut the opposing 60-degree angle.
Okay, so that was definitely the hardest strip to cut. It's really difficult to get the point to meet in the exact center of the strip. Now let's move on to the second strip, which is going to be a lot easier.
For the second type of strip, I set the blade to 1/3 the height of the strip. And essentially we're just making a really complicated version of Lincoln logs with 60-degree half-lap joints.
Okay, let's see how these guys fit together. Oof, that's definitely too tight. So you know what that means. Sanding time. Okay, so now that I've sanded it, it should fit together a lot better. Oh yeah, that's a perfect fit. Now we're talking. Now we can start putting this grid together. Okay, so I'm gonna start with 3 main strips. Thus concludes the first direction of strips. Now we gotta add the strips that are going this way. This is always the hardest part. That cracked just now. Come on, man.
Take a mallet to it. Not my favorite thing to do.
So after a little bit of struggle, we're finished with this initial grid work. But before I add it into the paddle, I want to tell you about the sponsor of this video, Skillshare.
Skillshare is an online learning community for creative and curious people, and it's especially great for people who love making stuff. If you want to learn a new creative skill set, whether it be woodworking, videography, or illustration, Skillshare has you covered with thousands of inspiring classes that will help you learn about whatever topic you're interested in. Now remember the sketch of the paddle that I showed you in the very beginning of the video? I drew this on my iPad using an app called Procreate. I've actually been taking a Skillshare class right now called Design Sketching Develop and render product designs in Procreate by Fed Rios. I've been wanting to get better at sketching out my projects before I actually start building so that I can develop the best possible design and also get a grasp of what I'll need in order to complete the project. I've learned some really helpful skills from this class, including rough sketching, as well as using the different brushes in Procreate. If you're also interested in learning a new skill or expanding your creative skill set, the first 1,000 people to click the link in the description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Once again, thank you to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the paddle.
So after attaching the router template with some STARBOND CA glue, it was time to router the interior profile with my pattern bit.
Whoa.
After maxing out the router depth, I switched over to a flush trim bit to get the remaining material.
Okay, so now it's time to do the tricky part, which is fitting this Kumiko piece into the opening of the paddle. For my most recent guitar build, I ended up just eyeballing where I should cut, and that seemed to work pretty well, so I'm gonna try that again. So now that we've glued in the Kumiko panel, we need to start cutting a ton of tiny pieces off of these 1/8" strips. And these pieces are going to become the infill, which is the actual pattern of the Kumiko.
To speed things up a bit, I taped a bunch of strips together so I could cut around 8 pieces off at once. However, I got a little bit carried away with cutting the strips, and I scared myself pretty good when one of the offcuts got launched to outer space by the table saw. Now that I'd cut a couple hundred pieces, it was time for the time-consuming part. These are my 2 homemade Kumiko jigs, which allow me to cut the infill pieces at 30 and 60 degree angles. Just as I was getting into the groove and was ready to keep cutting for the foreseeable hours ahead, my good friend and fellow YouTuber Drew Honflon sent me a text that would literally change how I make Kumiko forever.
From childhood, he is inherently lazy, but he is also mechanically minded. That's why he is always inventing things to do his work and ease his own burden. Extreme accuracy. Almost like slicing butter.
After cutting all the angles, it was finally time for the fun part. I fitted all the infill pieces into the center, which didn't take too long, but then I had to custom make all of the perimeter pieces by cutting them on the bandsaw. I didn't really show custom making these pieces, but it took a very long time.
All right, finally done with the Kumiko. It took literally forever, and the reason it took forever is because this is not the only paddle that I made. I also ended up making this paddle as well as this paddle, so we can triple the number of total infill pieces. I think I've probably had my fill of Kumiko for a while now.
Now you guys probably guessed that I was going to be filling the Kumiko with epoxy, otherwise how would these paddles work? That meant that I needed to create some sort of mold, which I ended up making with some yard signs that I totally didn't borrow from the streets of my neighborhood.
Okay, we're looking pretty good here. I really hope this prevents any leaks, but it's time to pour some epoxy here. Let's get to it.
I want to give a big thank you to the kind folks over at Total Boat for supplying all the epoxy for this project. I'm using their thickset epoxy, which will allow me to fill this 1/2-inch Kumiko in one pour. If you need any epoxy for your projects, be sure to use the code MAKEWITHMILES for 10% off any Total Boat products. Ever since the Kumiko guitar, I've wanted to try filling Kumiko with clear epoxy, and I thought it would look good for this paddle.
Guys, this is not good. There's so many bubbles. I don't know how I didn't catch this. I think what happened was that some air got trapped in between the bottom of the mold and the Kumiko, and that slowly produced bubbles which kind of rose to the top after I was gone. I'm hoping that when I start shaping this paddle that I'll carve past the bubbles and you won't even be able to see them when I'm done. So obviously this is not great news, but I'm gonna have to wait another 12 hours for the epoxy to fully harden so that I can start carving it. In the meantime though, I'm gonna do the other epoxy pours for the remaining 2 paddles, and hopefully these go a little bit smoother.
I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little apprehensive to do 2 more pours after what just happened. For the all maple paddle, I wanted to go with black epoxy, which is the combo that I use for my guitar. This was the one that I knew would look good, so if the others didn't turn out well, I'd at least have one good looking paddle. This next one, I went with the inverse colorway using white epoxy instead.
I'm gonna try and remove the plastic from the back. I'm hoping this is gonna come off pretty easily. This tape smells really bad. So it's the next day and this is looking pretty good. We have 0 bubbles, unlike the first one. Come on. There we go. Whew. That was definitely difficult to remove the back plastic piece, but now I'm ready to start shaping these paddles. The goal is to get these to be around 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch thick, which is pretty thin.
I started out by drawing a center line so that I could carve equally from both sides, and then I got to work shaping with the power planer. I also used my Arbortech turbo plane to shape the transition areas. I'll leave a link to the turbo plane in the description.
So now that we've shaped this and removed down a lot of the material, I can see that we still need to fill all of these bubbles here. But before I can fill them with epoxy, I have to drill out every single bubble so that the epoxy has something to stick to.
After filling those bubbles and letting the epoxy cure, I got back to work with the turbo plane, and after a little shaping, it was time for sanding. I used a 1/2-inch roundover bit on the shaft of the paddle, which made for a nice rounded shape that's comfortable in the hand. Next, it was time to get to work shaping the handle. You guys have probably noticed this air filtration helmet that I wear in almost every video. The great folks over at Trend Tool Technology offered to send me a new AirShield Pro because I've been using mine non-stop for the past few years. It's honestly my favorite and most used tool. I've added a link below if you want to go check it out. After I had the general shape, I contoured the handle using the turbo plane on my angle grinder. After I finished shaping Rory's paddle, I basically repeated this entire shaping process on the other two paddles. And here's a very fast version of how that went. The time had finally come for finishing. After talking to my friend Andrew Zito, who has made over 100 paddles using recycled skateboards, he recommended using 3 to 4 coats of some Total Boat high performance epoxy for the finish. You should seriously go check out Zito's YouTube channel for some awesome builds. These 2 Maple paddles are actually going to be for sale, so if you want one for yourself, there's a link in the description to the listings. Thank you guys so much for the support.
So the epoxy is now dry, and that means it's time to give this to my friend Rory and put it to the test. This is not only going to be the first test of this paddle, but also the maiden voyage of Rory's cedar strip canoe. So I'm going to head down to the river and we're going to see how this thing holds up. Push off, yeah. Paddle away. It's all good, it's all good. If you enjoyed this video, I would really appreciate it if you hit the like button. It actually helps me out quite a bit. If you want to see my next video, make sure you're subscribed. As always, thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.